Come on in. Hi, Nathan. Ready to go? Okay. So welcome, everyone. Good afternoon and aloha to everyone here in rainy Honolulu and online. I think it's still raining, right? Online around the world. My name is Jean Lee. I am the presidential chair here at the East-West Center. And thank you for joining us for our very last research seminar of 2025. So this East-West Center Research Speaker Series is a recurring program to spotlight emerging developments across the region. And through this series, we explore the political and economic processes that are reshaping the Asia-Pacific region in profound ways. And for this talk, we'd also like to thank POSCO and the Korea Foundation for their support for our Korea work here at the East-West Center. So today we'd like to welcome North Korea expert and former diplomat Joel Witt to the East-West Center and to Honolulu. He says it's been a while since he's been back, so welcome. Just a little bit about Joel. He is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., previously led the 38 North program, which provides research and analysis about North Korea, and that is how we met back when I was the AP bureau chief. If you recall, we had a secret arrangement to put out exclusive reporting from 38 North. So we've known each other for quite some time. But what we'll be hearing about today is his time as a State Department official who helped negotiate the landmark US DPRK agreed framework back in 1994. And I believe he also helped implement that deal until he left government in 2002. So he is a co-author of Going Critical, the First North Korea Nuclear Crisis. And now, a couple years later, he's published his second book, Fallout, the inside story of how America failed to disarm North Korea. He's going to tell us a little bit more about this book. I'd like to welcome him to the podium, but I'm going to pose a framing question before he begins. So I will head over there and welcome you to the podium. Thank you. Trying to unplug.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean.
So we're going to have about 20 minutes for Joel to share a little bit about his experience and also share what his book is about. But I wanted to frame this by asking him, because he has been looking at this issue for more than 30 years, can I start by asking you to set the scene and paint a picture of what North Korea was like when you first started on this journey in the early 1990s, and then paint a picture of where we are today, and then hopefully that will take us into your presentation.
Absolutely. It's like night and day, the difference between North Korea back then and North Korea today. So, back then, North Korea had no nuclear weapons stockpile. It had very few missiles, most of which could only reach South Korea, couldn't go any further than that. Moreover, in the early 1990s, North Korea had made a decision to engage the United States. And I think they made the decision based on their analysis of the geopolitical situation. So, as many of you may recall, in the early 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed, and China was reaching out to South Korea. And so North Korea saw some handwriting on the wall, and they decided they would reach out to the United States. And in doing that, the nuclear program, which was under development then, was on the chopping block. But I want to add one other point here very quickly. It wasn't just a geopolitical decision. It was also a domestic decision. And I say that because there's been this periodic urge on the part of North Korean leaders to modernize their economy. And it's very clear if you look at meetings in the early 1990s between Kim Il-sung and visitors from abroad, that was an important part of his policy. But to do that, the North Koreans had to reduce their massive military budget. And they also needed assistance, and they wanted assistance from the West. So all of those factors combined to put North Korea on a path of, I would say, 30 years of trying to engage the United States. Today, none of that applies. First of all, North Korea is not interested anymore in engaging the United States. Part of it is because of the failed approach during the Trump administration, but part of it is because of geopolitics. In 2021, as the US withdrew from Afghanistan, the North Koreans decided that the US was a receding power. It wasn't the power it had been before. And they looked around for new partners, and they found Russia. And it's turned out to be a very good relationship for the North Koreans, and I guess for the Russians too. So North Korea is aligned with Russia and also, of course, China, who are not our friends. Besides that, and we'll get into this more, during the Obama and Trump administrations, the North Korean nuclear-armed missile arsenal grew enormously. So at the beginning of the Obama administration, North Korea had maybe a handful of nuclear weapons and a few missiles that could reach Japan. By the end of the Obama administration, 8 years later, they were well on their way to building a much larger arsenal of nuclear weapons and an arsenal of missiles that could attack American cities. And that continued under President Trump. So that's another big difference from when I was working on the agreed framework. Finally, North Korea has embarked on other military modernization programs. They're modernizing their conventional forces. They're modernizing their defense industry. And all of this seems to be aimed not just at the United States, but at the country which is now their main enemy, South Korea. So it's a very different situation today than it was in the early 1990s. So I'm sorry, do you want me to just launch into a talk about the book, or do you have other?
Yes, no, that's great. You did exactly what I was hoping, was to draw the line between their aspirations in the early 90s and then where we are today. I was actually just thinking, should I provide some statistics, but do you have them off the top of your head? I mean, the latest estimates are, we've seen year after year, the arsenal just expand exponentially. And so we'll get into that. But can I just go back and ask you, how did you get into all of this? Was North Korea a topic that you were interested in back then? Because it wasn't on my radar.
You know, honestly, I wasn't interested in it at all. I had spent, I'm trying to remember now, I joined the State Department in 1986, worked in the Intelligence Bureau for a year or two, then moved into working on US-Soviet arms control negotiations. So I worked on the two strategic arms control agreements, the agreement, the INF Treaty, the agreement which covered European missiles. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, I kind of started to get bored, and I looked around for something else. And I ended up working on North Korea because, you know, I had friends who were working on it, and I also knew Bob Gallucci, who became the special envoy. So it was just, I fell into it, and I haven't been able to fall out of it for, I guess it's over 30 years now. So it's It's been a long time. I
And what did
guess.
we know? So what did you know about North Korea in the early 1990s when you first stumbled into this?
I knew there was, a problem with them because we knew they were building a nuclear weapons program. We were trying to get them to join the international agreements, the NPT, and to become members of the International Atomic Energy Agency so we could put it under control. And then right after I joined the effort, the North Koreans suddenly announced they were going to withdraw. They had agreed to join the NPT. Then they announced they were going to withdraw.
Okay, just so everyone knows, we're talking about the nuclear non-proliferation.
Nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Sorry for the alphabet soup. Yeah, so that was basically the starting point for my involvement in the State Department, which lasted till the beginning of the Bush administration.
And at the time, North Korea was ruled by
Oh, it was Kim Jong-il.
Kim Il-sung.
Kim Il-sung, sorry. It was Kim Il-sung, and yes, until 94 when he died in the middle of negotiations we were having to bring the nuclear program under control.
Okay, so that brings us up to 1994 as you were negotiating the agreed framework. And just give us a quick update on, just very briefly, what was the agreed framework? I referred to it earlier, but can you tell us quickly what that involved?
Yeah, the agreed framework was the only denuclearization deal we've been able to reach with North Korea. And it was reached in 1994. And essentially, the North Koreans agreed to give up the program they were developing to produce material for bombs. And in return, we were going to give them two what's called light water reactors, which are resistant to producing material for nuclear weapons. And the cost was $5 billion. And we were going to give them heavy fuel oil deliveries as well. But another part of that agreement, which people often gloss over, was it set us on a path towards ending the Cold War in Northeast Asia. There was the beginning of recognizing each other and establishing diplomatic relations. There were promises to lift sanctions. There was discussion of people-to-people exchanges. So all of the additional measures covered the political and economic barriers between the two countries as well. So it was really quite an accomplishment. And I should mention it came after we almost had a second Korean War in the spring of 1994 because North Korea started to do activities that seemed to be moving towards producing nuclear weapons. And the Clinton administration was getting ready for A, launching a preemptive attack against North Korea's nuclear facilities, and B, beefing up our forces on the peninsula. So it was really a very tense time period. And sometimes I feel like people didn't really realize what was going on at the time.
So how close were we to a preemptive attack?
That's a good question. No one knew. I mean, President Clinton was briefed by the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs about what that would entail. But no one knew whether he would launch the attack or not. He didn't indicate any preference at the time. And we didn't get to the point where he had to make a decision because that's when Jimmy Carter stepped in, traveled to North Korea, met with Kim Il-sung, reached an agreement, and we sort of got back onto the negotiating track.
That is an interesting reference. Jimmy Carter is revered in North Korea, as you probably know, and as an example of a figure, an American figure who has been able to play a diplomatic role against all odds in a place like North Korea. I will point out that there is a pattern that we're now familiar with of bringing the Korean Peninsula to the brink of war in order perhaps to instigate diplomacy, right? But this might have been the first example that we saw very concretely of that pattern emerging. Because what we saw, of course, you said that crisis was in the spring of 1994, but that was just before Kim Il-sung passed away, am I right?
Yeah, he passed away on the second day of
Oh
negotiations
my
in
God.
Geneva.
What did you do to him?
Well, I won't get into the jokes we made, but the point was, the North Koreans were on this path, this diplomatic path. And of course, Kim Il-sung and his son, Kim Jong-il, had been working together very closely. And so Kim Jong-il just continued down that road.
Okay, and how, when you look back at that, did that shape the outcome of the agreed framework, which was negotiated a couple months later?
Oh, I don't think Kim Il-sung's death had anything to do with how the agreement turned out. The North Koreans had already decided what their strategy was.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a question of getting over the discombobulation of his death, which required the United States to do some fancy footwork, diplomatic footwork, to issue condolences on the death of their leader. It made a big difference, and things proceeded smoothly after we did that.
We have to point out what a huge deal this was. The North Koreans were always told that their leader was almost like a god. So his death was a massive, massive event.
Yeah, it was a big
North
event,
Korea.
very big event.
And
but they continued down the road. I think their policy was set in their minds.
so I want to pivot and ask when you made your first trip, because you were there to implement this deal. So when was your first trip to North Korea, and what do you remember about that? Do you cover that in your book? Because everybody's first trip to North Korea is incredibly memorable.
Well, yeah, there are a couple of things I remember from my first few trips, which started in 1996. And I didn't mention this, but part of the agreed framework was American technicians went to North Korea's main nuclear facility at a place called Yonbyon. And we were there to help the North Koreans store, this is going to get a little technical, store the spent fuel rods from their reactors, which contained bomb-making material. And then the plan was to ship it out of the country. So there were Americans on the ground at their main nuclear facility working with the North Koreans on accomplishing this task. So I can't remember if it was exactly the first time I went there, but one of the early times, of course, I always had an escort. There were foreign ministry people with me. We drive up to the gate of this pretty secret place. No one was allowed in, obviously. We drive up to the gate. My escort, foreign ministry officials, gave the guard their IDs. I gave the guard my ID, and he said, "The American can pass, but you guys can't go in." So it was kind of interesting. And I had subsequent experiences where it was very clear that the foreign ministry people and the people in the military or the intelligence services, they didn't like working together at all. And I'll mention what other experience. We went to Yonbyon in winter, and the roads are very icy. And as you may imagine, the roads in North Korea are not great. So, they're driving me to Yonbyon in this, it's probably 10-year-old Mercedes. And the driver was going very fast. And on the side of the road, there was this giant oxen pulling a cart. And our car slid into the ox and hit him. And the car had enormous dents, but the ox didn't matter. He just kept walking on. So, there are all these kinds of funny experiences you have when you're in North Korea.
Did the sight of an ox-drawn cart surprise you? I
No.
mean, no. I mean, the contrast though between when they are still using ox as a main, because they don't have fuel for tractors, they're primarily still using ox.
Well, that was
Oxen.
1996. So I think today it's obviously gotten a lot better, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're still using oxen to pull carts.
Well, I'm very envious because when you drive up toward, when you take that highway from Pyongyang, there is a tiny little side that says Myeongbyon, which is how it's pronounced in North Korea. And it's only written in Korean. And I would always say, can we just stop there for a bathroom break? But I was never able to go in. So I'm envious that you got to see that. That is obviously the centerpiece of their nuclear program.
Yeah, back then it was probably the only facility related to their nuclear weapons program. And of course, since then, they've expanded enormously. And there are lots of other facilities. And we know about some of them and others we're not quite sure about.
Take us up to the implementation then. It sounds like you had access. What went wrong from 1994?
There's a lot of talk about the agreement eventually collapsed. Let's put it that way. There's not a lot of talk about that. It collapsed in 2002 under the Bush administration. So there was a lot of talk about, well, the Americans, the Japanese, the South Koreans weren't delivering these reactors on time. There was a time set in the agreed framework, and we were behind schedule. There's no doubt about it. I don't think that's why the agreement collapsed. What happened was we discovered in 1998 that the North Koreans were essentially cheating on the agreement. They were developing another way of building nuclear weapons, which is using highly enriched uranium. And we discovered that. So that presented us with a choice. What do you do when you find someone cheating on a deal? Do you walk away from the deal? Do you give them an ultimatum and walk away? Or do you use the leverage provided you by the deal to fix the problem? And so the Clinton administration, in its last few years in office, decided to use the leverage to fix the problem and came up with an approach designed to do that and started to unveil that approach in 2000 when President Clinton met with the number 2 North Korean leader in the Oval Office. We started to unveil it then, and if Al Gore had won the election, we would have continued down that road. Unfortunately, Al Gore did not win the election, and the Bush administration had a very different attitude, as everyone knows, to negotiating with countries like North Korea. And that was, of course, reflected in the whole war with Iraq. So the Bush administration essentially presented the North Koreans with an ultimatum. Stop cheating or else. And the North Koreans withdrew from the deal very quickly. They withdrew from the deal and started up their nuclear weapons program. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that they were willing to negotiate. They were willing to reach a new deal that would plug the hole in the agreed framework. So Don Oberdorfer, who was a Washington Post reporter and spent a lot of time in North Korea, he and Don Gregg, who is a former ambassador of the United States to South Korea, met with the North Koreans and brought a message back from Kim Jong-il saying, we want to negotiate. We want to fix this problem. And it was rejected by the Bush White House.
I think you raise an interesting point, which is that the North Koreans have had, I'm guessing, almost the same people negotiating on their side for this entire duration, whereas we've had a cycle of politics, right? Administrations coming in and out with different policies. I'm curious if I'm characterizing that right. And I would like for you to tell us a little bit about people on the other side of the table, because you have had quite a bit of experience with those North Koreans.
Yeah, well, I'm computing in my head, when did they disappear, these people? For most of, certainly for the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration, they were the same people. The same senior level people who were the negotiators, and the same working level people who moved up the chain of command. So today, for example, the North Korean foreign minister, her name is Chae Sun-hee. She was working on US relations with the United States in the 1990s. She started out as an interpreter, although it was very clear she was much more than that. And it turns out, she's been very close to the Kim family. And there are even rumors that she's the illegitimate child of Kim Il-sung. I don't know if that's true or not, and she and I have had this relationship for a long time, which I might characterize as being friends, although I haven't seen her since 2016. And so let me use her as an example of someone we were dealing with, and the Trump administration dealt with her too. She was the premier American watcher in North Korea. She knew everything from politics to culture, everything about the United States. She would read everything, to the point when in 2008, I was meeting with her in Berlin, and we were having dinner. She was sitting next to me, and she turned to me and said, "Have you read It Takes a Village, Hillary Clinton's book?" And I'm an American. I should have read it, right? I didn't read it. So it was sort of embarrassing, but she was a voracious reader and absorbed a lot of information about North Korea. But beyond that, very bright, speaks Chinese and Russian, educated in North Korea, but also partially abroad, has a wicked sense of humor. She can be very sarcastic, and, just really a top-notch person who, despite, her involvement with US North Korean relations for decades, now is the focal point of relations with Russia. So, this is someone who's obviously loyal to the regime.
I take it you've written about Madam Che in your book, because I can't wait.
Yeah, so the book goes, she appears, in the beginning of the book, she appears in the beginning of the book because we had a track 2 private meeting with North Korean officials right after Donald Trump was elected. And we had a private meeting in Geneva. And so she appears there. She was the sort of point of the spear in dealing with Americans for many years. And so she appears there, but she's in the book, throughout the book. Most of the book is on Obama, the Obama administration, and the first term of Trump. So she's in the book from that point until the end of the Trump administration, where she makes an appearance in Hanoi at a very key moment in the US North Korean negotiations, right before Donald Trump walked out of Hanoi.
So she is a key figure in the US DPRK relationship. It's interesting that she did not face punishment, or maybe she did, but it wasn't significant.
No, she wasn't punished. She is really plugged in. So I think not only is she close to the Kim Jong-un, She's close to his sister. You know, there's information that she knew them when they were children. So she is very much plugged in and very much a close advisor to Kim Jong-un on foreign policy issues. So I can imagine, and this is getting a little bit into inside ball, she sort of stood back during the Trump administration. She wasn't the main negotiator. And I suspect she stood back because she wasn't sure how things were going to turn out. And so there were the main negotiators who were punished. And then there was her who sort of hovered in the background. But then at that key moment in Hanoi, she stepped in. And she stepped in, and there was a meeting in the hallway at the building where the summit was taking place, a meeting between her and Steve Biegun, who was the American negotiator, where they started to make progress towards a deal after Trump and Kim had reached a stalemate. So she was there at that key moment. And unfortunately, as the two of them were, trying to reach a deal, Donald Trump walked out. He walked by them out the door, and all the Americans had to follow him. You can't stay and negotiate when the president of the United States walks out. So she was there at that key moment.
Can I ask at this juncture what you think happened in Hanoi? Why it was President Trump walked out, and what the consequences of that were?
Well, there's a short answer to that, right?
Yeah, give us the short answer.
Well, I'll give you the short answer, then I'll back off and give a bigger answer. The short answer was Donald Trump walked out because he was getting frustrated. And, there's all sorts of nicknames for Trump. Anthony Fauci said he has the patience of a kindergarten. There's another nickname for him, the 2-minute man. And you can say, it's not a secret. He's an impatient guy. So what happened in Hanoi was, contrary to a lot of the reporting in public, Trump and Kim weren't discussing a big denuclearization deal. They were discussing a small deal focused on this Yongbyon nuclear facility. And the issue was how much of his nuclear program would Kim Jong-un agree to dismantle, and how many sanctions would Trump agree to lift in return. So the two of them were bargaining about that. And Kim Jong-un wouldn't give any ground. He wanted to just dismantle the Yongbyon facility and essentially have all the sanctions lifted that had been imposed since the Obama administration, which was quite substantial. And Trump wasn't going to do that. So they were haggling. And Trump got frustrated. Essentially, he got frustrated. The meeting adjourned, and he decided to walk out before the summit was over. And that's what happened. He walked out. And so, the issue is, of course, if he had stayed, if Biegun and Madam Che had been able to make progress, what would have happened? Would the summit have been a complete failure or not?
But from your point of view and from your experience watching all of this, I assume from DC at the time, did you wake up hoping that there had been a deal? I mean, at least I went to sleep. I was like, I'm going to wake up and there will be a deal or no deal. Were you thinking there should be a deal? Or were you worried about a deal?
I don't even remember what I was thinking. I don't remember, honestly. I just remember that the main thing is no one expected the summit to collapse like it did.
Certainly not Kim Jong-un. That was a big
Well,
surprise.
Kim Jong-un didn't. And there's this story that, after Donald Trump walked out, Kim Jong-un stalked back to his hotel room and slammed the door. And You know, there are other indicators, obvious indicators. He was a very unhappy man. And in part because, you know, the North Korean media was there covering him. So one of the American negotiators said to me in an interview, it was about as CNN as it gets in North Korea. So here is this summit. They're all there expecting it to be a success, and it wasn't. They tried to pretend initially that it wasn't so bad, but you know, that didn't last very long.
Okay, at this point, I would like to open it up for questions from those of you who are in the room as well as online. There's still a lot that we could cover here, and you're welcome to bring up some points that we haven't been able to touch on in your presentation. But does anyone, if you have a question, please just raise your hand and I'll ask you to hit the microphone button. You'll see the red light come on, and then identify yourself and your affiliation or your former affiliation. Does anyone want to kick off? I think Maria Laura has a question. She's stalking you.
We're gonna continue the conversation we had yesterday.
I just want to bring you back for a moment from Hanoi to the 1994 agreed framework, because there is a question that all the people I talked to that were involved in these negotiations give me different answers. So you say they cheated on the agreement with the uranium. The North Koreans argue that they didn't cheat because the text of the agreement did not mention uranium specifically. It was on the plutonium. And so when so for me I haven't read the text of the agreement. For me, it's relevant in terms of what would this mean in terms of other negotiations. If it was true, I've got the analysis from, the takeaway from people who agree with that is that we have to be very careful because they, when they negotiate, they will stick to the text, the written text in a religious way, and that's their takeaway. But their takeaway is that they wouldn't cheat if you're careful with that. What's your...
Yeah, well, there are 2 points here. Number one, you know, people can debate whether they were cheating or not. The fact is there's a part of the agreement that says both sides will respect the North-South denuclearization agreement, which banned uranium enrichment on the Korean Peninsula. So yes, it doesn't say, and we really mean uranium enrichment. It says that. So, you know, we could all debate that, and I know people engaged in this discussion way back when. The fact is, it was an activity that they should not have been pursuing, and they knew it. And we, in the Clinton administration, embarked on an approach to fix it. And they were willing to do that. So that's number one. Number two, you know, this gets into negotiating agreements, right? And I'm going to refer to my nuclear arms control experience. And most of you, I don't know if most of you are familiar with past nuclear arms control agreements. But, you know, Jimmy Carter, was it Jimmy? Yeah, Jimmy Carter reached an agreement called SALT II, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And it was the second one. And one of the big criticisms of SALT II was it was too brief. It wasn't detailed enough. It left too much to chance that the Russians, the Soviets could cheat. So the Reagan administration, which I was part of, came in and reached the START agreements. The START agreements, if you've ever looked at them, or I can't remember the exact length, but they're hundreds of pages in an effort to be very specific. But what you would find as you go through all the pages, you can find more and more places where you can say to yourself, hey, that's not specific enough. You know, someone could find a way around that. So in fact, in an effort to be more specific, you were creating more places where people might fudge. So it's just the nature of the beast.
Are there any questions in the room? Otherwise, I'm going to jump in and ask you how your thinking about North Korea may have changed with all this interaction you've had with them over the past 30 years. Because you did mention your track. So we should mention that you've been engaged in track 1.5 and track 2 diplomacy with the North Koreans for a good 20 years, right? So you've had these opportunities to engage the North Koreans, maybe behind the scenes a little bit to try to get some diplomacy going. But how has all that interaction changed the way you look at North Korea and North Koreans?
Well, you know, there's this big debate among people, right? There are lots of people who say, gee, North Korea never intended to give up its nuclear weapons. It was never serious about negotiations. So since the 1960s, they were sort of on this path to where they are today. And there's a different viewpoint, which I've been part of, that yes, they were serious. And, you know, it's sometimes more serious than others. And what I tried to do in the book is to make that clear. And I do that through, and it's hopefully in an engaging way, really going into the details of what talks were, negotiations, and track 2 meetings. And you see in reading, you know, it feels like you're in the room with it. In reading it, you can see this is serious. They can't be making this stuff up. You know, there's not a couple of 100-page script that all North Koreans read before they go and meet Americans. So you could see that this was a serious effort. If we're talking about how my attitude has changed, I think the big change is today, because of some of the things I was mentioning to you earlier, I don't think, you know, I have my doubts about engagement. And particularly engagement between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. And I didn't have doubts during the first Trump administration because he had the right advisors to help him. The North Koreans were serious. Kim Jong-un was serious. That was very clear. And Trump seemed to be on the right path in terms of not demanding, you know, complete denuclearization right away. Today, very different situation. They're not serious about, or not as serious about engagement. Trump doesn't have any advisors. He's even said publicly, no one knows Kim Jong-un as well as he does. And Kim Jong-un is not serious about engagement today. So that's really the big change in my attitude. I think up until 2019, I would have said, this can still work. Now I have serious doubts.
And how much do the relationships with Russia and China, and also I would say there's cyber activity and illicit financing campaigns, how much does that have to do with helping buoy Kim Jong-un and give him some confidence?
Oh, well, absolutely. Those are his 2 main allies, and they're not our friends. So their objective is to, you know, push the United States out of Northeast Asia. That's Kim Jong-un's objective now. It's not engagement. So, you know, you can really see where he wants to head today. And one of the examples I use with people is, you know, if Trump met Kim Jong-un in a summit, I could see Kim Jong-un saying, hey, why don't you start withdrawing your troops from South Korea? You know, we all know Trump has had his doubts about the US-South Korean alliance. And Trump might take the bait. And I think that'd be a big mistake.
I do want to ask you about South Korea. I mean, South Korea is a country that has transformed in so many unexpected ways since the early 90s, since 1994. But the relationship between North and South Korea is also at the lowest we've seen in many, many years. But how has the inter-Korean relationship benefited or complemented US DPRK relations and diplomacy? And where are we now, would you say?
I mean, the book goes into detail about 3 South Korean administrations, President Lee, President Park, and President Moon. And you can see, of course, the relationship between the United States and South Korea with each of those administrations, and particularly everything President Moon was doing to support Donald Trump. And it was a lot. So President Moon's administration, as many of you may know, made a lot of progress with North Korea. The summits he had with Kim Jong-un were very productive. And unfortunately, all of that has evaporated now, given North Korea's movement away from engagement. So, you know, the history of US-South Korean relations dealing with North Korea is up and down. Sometimes we work together, sometimes we work against each other. So it's kind of hard for me to go through all of that in a few minutes, really.
I should point out that Maria Laura has her own significant research on negotiations with DPRK. So you are also in your own right an expert on this topic, but from the European perspective.
Yeah, so I should apologize because my questions are kind of a bit nerdy maybe, and so maybe not of interest for everybody. I would like to ask, because again, I'm sorry I haven't read your book yet. But so with what happened again in Hanoi, where they couldn't agree on the sanctions, right? And I wonder what came out of the interviews that you made in terms of the US calculus, because there is a part of the North Korean watcher community that kind of criticizes the fact that the US approach was still too focused on sanctions as the main or even only leverage with North Korea, and that actually affected the outcome of that summit. What's your point of view and what you think came out from the interviews that you had with the main player?
Yeah, I mean, sanctions were a big part of our leverage, and people were very hesitant to give them up. But, you know, I'm not sure I would blame the Trump administration for being hesitant, because there was no progress on the nuclear issue. And that was the trade-off. How much of their nuclear weapons facilities would they give up? What sanctions would we lift? That was the trade-off left for the two leaders. So yes, along the way, we could have unilaterally lifted one sanction here or there, but that was still the basic trade-off. And, you know, I suspect that in the hallway conversation that I've described to you, they were moving in the direction, Steve Biegun and Madam Che, of actually coming to a trade-off. How many sanctions are we going to lift? And how much of your nuclear facilities are you going to dismantle? What it looked like. Well, it was yon beyond for a certain amount of sanctions. I do know that during the summit, I mean, during the pre-negotiations, this is probably getting into details people aren't going to be fascinated by. But during the pre-negotiations, where the US and North Koreans reached a 10-page summit draft document that resolved every issue the US and North Korea had been working on for decades. During the except for the two I've mentioned, during those negotiations, the US delegation asked for instructions about lifting sanctions. And they were given permission to lift sanctions that probably would have saved North Korea on an annual basis $1 billion. But they couldn't do it until the North Koreans moved on the nuclear issue. And the North Koreans never moved until Kim Jong-un met Donald Trump. So I guess, everyone, the point here is this summit, which was, labeled a big catastrophe, could have been a big success. And the key issue is, if Donald Trump had stayed around for the whole summit, what would have happened? That's the big issue here. And the second point I want to make is, just try to imagine, there's this field of history called counterfactual history. So just try to imagine if Donald Trump's summitry had been a success, that US-North Korean relations improved, that we move forward in implementing all of the things that were reached in that draft document I mentioned to you. If we had moved forward with that, where would we be with North Korea today? Would North Korea be a close ally of Russia? Would North Korea have sent troops to Ukraine? Would their nuclear and missile arsenal continue to grow? There are a lot of big issues here, and that's why, it's important to understand what happened at that summit and the subsequent summit, which was also a disaster. They met subsequently a couple of months later on the DMZ, and that turned into a disaster also.
But is there anything that that came out of it that is positive? For example, just the fact that they established relations, they clearly have a bromance. Will they not get back to that?
I'm sorry, Jean, I don't want to be like Typhoid Mary here, but there's really nothing that came out of it that's positive. And you could even argue Donald Trump thinking he understands Kim Jong-un because of their bromance is not a positive thing, because he doesn't understand him. And this shouldn't be a revelation, because look how he's dealing with other leaders like Putin or President or Xi Jinping, or you can go down the list. He thinks he understands these people. And I think he's starting to realize he doesn't really understand them, but I don't think he understands Kim Jong-un.
We do have a question from somebody who chooses to be anonymous, but asking what conditions, so it might be, okay, what conditions might lead to a reunification of North and
Is it
South
Kim
Korea?
Jong-un or?
Might be. It could be a spy, could be one of these North Korean hackers who's logged in, and because this is often a question I get from the North Korean hackers. So go ahead.
What conditions could lead to reunification?
Yes.
Sorry, that's when I don't see any conditions except North Korea collapsing. And that's not going to happen as far as I can tell. So I don't see any conditions leading to reunification. And I think the South Koreans, if they haven't already, have pretty much given up on reunification. And certainly the North Koreans have dropped it, at least peaceful reunification. So yes, I know this has been a big dream for decades. And I'm not sure if it was ever that feasible, really, but certainly today, not feasible. Maybe I should remain anonymous.
No, I mean, this is a very interesting question. It's probably worth a whole other seminar.
Yes.
You
Right.
don't cover it in your book, I'm going to guess.
No.
But you know, we do have the new South, not new, but President Lee Jae-myung in South Korea recently said that he wanted to restore communications with North Korea. So clearly he's got this new initiative, the END initiative. But this is not what you cover in your book. So I want to ask if there
No,
is,
I can talk about that.
but are there any other questions? Yes, please go ahead. Can you speak into a microphone?
Thank you. My name is Chizuko Allen. I come from the Asian Studies Department at UH Manoa. So my question is about the nuclear site Yeonbyeon, because when the negotiation was ongoing or when it broke down, I heard that actually Yeonbyeon was an old site and North
Yes.
Korea had many new sites that were more critical at that time. So it was just kind of a show on the side of North Korea. And so, Kim Jong-un was unwilling to talk about any other sites, right? So that's how the negotiation broke down. That's what I kind of heard at the time. So
So
that your
there are a couple of
understanding?
points there. First of all, that is completely incorrect. Yes, Yeonbyeon had been around and was their first nuclear facility. So it had been around since the 1960s. And there were old facilities there. There's no doubt about it. The plutonium production part of Yeonbyeon, which was what's called a reprocessing plant that was like 3 football fields long, a nuclear reactor that produced these spent fuel rods that contain plutonium. And there were a few other facilities related to that. But there was also a new uranium enrichment facility at Yeonbyeon that had been built by 2010. There were 2 other suspected facilities where it appears the North Koreans could produce materials to build hydrogen bombs. And there may have been some other facilities within the boundary of Yeonbyeon, which was quite substantial. It was hundreds of acres. So and I can't remember how many buildings there were, but there were a lot of buildings there. So that is not accurate.
Any last questions before we wrap, Derek?
Yeah, hi, I'm Derek Brar. I'm a East West Center staff alumnus. You mentioned a few sort of key waypoints, and I know your book kind of focuses on America's failure to get North Korea to denuclearize or give up nuclear ambitions. And you mentioned, President Bush switching policy and delivering an ultimatum, to completely denuclearize or else, and then the North Koreans turning back from that. You also mentioned the failed summits with President Trump. And then I know, during the Obama administration and, a lot of talk about whether sanctions were really doing anything. So what would you say is the greatest factor in kind of the situation we have today where it seems like the nuclear program, but then, North Korea's nuclear capability can't be reversed?
Look, if you sort of step back for the big picture, and you've mentioned, Obama administration, 8 years of failure. So when you have Trump, you have Bush, Clinton, not entirely a failure, but there were parts of it that didn't go well. If you take a step back and think, well, why did this happen? I mean, of course, you can think of very specific reasons and very specific events. But to me, the big reason is we didn't understand the North Koreans at all. We didn't understand what motivated them. And we didn't understand how they viewed their national interests. And on top of that, we overestimated our ability to steer them away from what they thought their national interests were. And this is not a new story, right? In American foreign policy. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, you could go on and on and on with this story. And this is something that runs through every administration in dealing with North Korea.
Before we wrap up, we do have one more question that came in online. And so if we can just take this one quickly, thank you all for your patience. How do you think the North would react if Japan and/or South Korea decided to proceed with their own nuclear weapons development? A very important
It's
question.
an excellent question because, I don't know what your expertise is in the room, but there is an arms race in Northeast Asia, and it's not just North Korea. It's Japan, it's South Korea, it's the United States, it's China, it's Russia. There is a serious arms race going on. North Korea has nuclear weapons, but also there's a lot of talk. There's been increasing talk in South Korea about it building its own nuclear weapons. And this has become more and more serious over the years. So you could, as this person is raising the possibility, what would happen if South Korea built nuclear weapons? It may be hard for them to do. It's not possible right now, but even trying to build them could create a serious crisis. But is a Northeast Asia with every country armed with nuclear weapons a safer place or not a safer place? There have been academic debates that if every country had nuclear weapons, the world would be a safer place. That's not the case here. So if Japan has always had that capability, or for quite some time. And I think if South Korea actually was able to do it, Japan would reevaluate its current posture and might seriously consider building nuclear weapons also.
And I do think that that is a very appropriate question to end on, because it does get to the question of what the consequences are for having, I shouldn't say allowed, but for North Korea being capable of developing its arsenal to this point.
Yeah,
Is that it's brought us to a modern day nuclear arms race in
Exactly.
Northeast Asia. So
exactly.
that is the sliding doors moment where we think, had we been able to deal with this in 1994, 1995, where would we be? However, we have not in 30 years, and this is where we are.
Well, even if we dealt with it in 2019, we'd be in a very different spot in that situation as well.
And I will say, because our new president here, Celeste Connors, is very focused on economic security and the implications of that in the region, I always try to remind people that our peace and prosperity are directly impacted by this nuclear umbrella or this nuclear shadow hanging over our heads. South Korea in particular, as such a key economic partner, will never quite have the economic potential, will never reach that economic potential if it always has this nuclear blackmail hanging over its head. So before we end, I just want to make sure that you remind us the name of your book, and I think, where can we buy it?
Okay. Well, it's called Fallout, the inside story of America's failure to disarm North Korea. It's on Amazon. And I don't know what local bookstores it's in. It's in Barnes and Noble. And also, I'll discuss this more with Jean. I think I'm able to get an author's discount for everyone in the room.
Great, and online.
And online, sorry.
So we will try to get that to everyone who
Now
wants
we're in the realm of modern technology, and if it's not nuclear, I don't understand it. So, yes, so if anyone's interested, they can follow up.
Okay, so share that with us. We'll share it. I want to thank everybody in the room who came out on this freezing cold, I mean, for us, relatively freezing cold day in Honolulu. We're just torturing everyone online who's zooming in from winter. I want to say 고맙습니다 to the North Koreans who are in the room and 감사합니다 to the, not in the room, sorry. None of you are North Korean. 감사합니다 to the South Koreans and happy holidays and Mele Kalikimaka to everyone here. Thank you, Joel. Welcome back. And I think it was a really interesting discussion, but I hope we've just teased it enough so that they develop an interest in diplomacy in North Korea and buy your book.
Good,
Thank you, everyone.
thanks. Thank you.